Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about male victims of domestic violence. Now, on the podcast today with me is the chairperson of Men's Voices Ireland, David Walsh. How are you doing, David?
Very good, Jeff. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, let's get into it. So, let's start with the facts. Now, the last official figures that the Irish government use are from 2005, so they're pretty out of date. So according to that data, 29% of victims of severe domestic violence are men. How do those figures compare to international figures, David?
Actually, the international figures show a higher victimisation rate for men. Quite a much higher domestic violence victimisation rate. They actually show parity or close to it. Men and women perpetrate domestic violence at comparable rates. That is the conclusion of the overwhelming majority of the international domestic violence research literature. And that is an extraordinary fact because it's never covered. We never hear about it. The public seems to be entirely unaware of the volume and depth and of this evidence, and yet the official narrative continues to remain unchallenged.
Now, I think a big statistic that would kind of factor into that is the fact that only 5% of male victims of domestic violence will actually report the abuse that they suffer. So why do you think so few men report?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are various reasons put forward. An old reason was that men were actually too embarrassed to come forward much of the time. Some men were indeed ashamed to come forward that they've been abused by their partners, to admit that. There are other causes linked to it. Perhaps some men feel they would not even be believed. That has been a factor that has been there for some years as well. But a new evidence is now coming out particularly from Men's Aid, and they say that a lot of men don't report this for fear that if they do, a separation will occur. They would be removed from their homes and they would lose access to their children. So many men are now inclined to say very little about it in order to remain in touch with their children.
So there's a lot of international evidence that male and female perpetration of domestic violence is pretty much equal. So this never makes it into the official narrative that the public is exposed to. So what is the extent of that issue?
That's right. This is correct, and it's a tremendous failing that's out there. I could go through a whole range of surveys if we had the time, but I will just mention perhaps three for now. In 2013, a major report was published called the PASK report. It's called, that stands for Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Report, PASK. It was commissioned by a new journal called Partner Abuse, which incidentally is a very prestigious journal. And in 2010, they asked a number of researchers in the US, the UK, and in Canada to carry out a comprehensive review of the research literature that then existed. So this is a review, the most comprehensive review of the research literature ever conducted. It started in 2010. There were 42 scholars, senior scholars involved. Along with these, there were 70 research assistants. They were based at 20 universities and research institutions throughout those three countries. And they reported in 2013, it's a monumental report, as I say, and its findings, if I can summarize them shortly, are that except for sexual coercion, men and women perpetrate domestic violence across all the types, physical and non-physical, at comparable rates. Women are as controlling as men. The majority of domestic violence is bidirectional. That is, both partners are engaged in it. Domestic violence by men and women is correlated with essentially the same risk factors for both men and women. And finally, men and women perpetrate domestic violence for similar reasons. Now, it's probably fair to say that these findings completely contradict, completely refute the official version
figures,
of the figures, of the narrative that's out there. It utterly refutes, overturns the narrative that's out there. In fact, the narrative that's there, is the official narrative, it's due to the feminists. The feminists put that narrative into the public domain back around the 1970s or 80s, and it has remained there since. And it has been kept in place, not only by the feminists themselves, but by official bodies, such as state agencies, by the state itself, and the media are completely complicit in keeping this narrative on board. That's the complicity of the media is the main reason, in my view, why this narrative, this alternative view, has not been brought to public attention. And this is a tremendously appalling fact. It's an appalling indictment of the media that this is so. I could go on, if you want to, I can go on to another major report. The US state agency called the Center for Disease Control, that carries out a survey at regular intervals. It's called the NISVS survey, National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And it's a highly reliable survey. I want to just look at two two reports, one from 2010 and one from 2015, if I may. The report, which came out in 2015, was startling because for the first time it found that men were more likely to be victims of physical abuse than women were. This was the first time apparently that this happened in their surveys. They found, and they asked the question, over the previous 12 months, what abuse did you suffer, how many times, and so on, of people. And they found that the victimization rate for men was 3.8%, and that for women was 2.9%. This is overall physical violence. So men were a good deal more likely to be victims. But in order to close off a loophole which is often exploited by feminists, they also looked at severe violence. And they asked the same question, but this time restricted to severe violence. That's punching and kicking and striking with a weapon. And they found that the rates were practically equal for men and women. It was 2% for men, 1.9% for women had been victims of severe violence in the previous 12 months. This was a most striking finding. Now, if I look at the 2010 report, that, amongst many other findings, it looked at the issue of coercive control. And their finding on coercive control over the previous 12 months was that female victims of coercive control, 10.7%, male victims, 15.2%. That's a massive difference. That's a 40% greater incidence among men than among women. That's an enormous difference.
That's definitely not something like you'd kind of hear publicly on mainstream media.
That's not something you will hear about on mainstream media. It's not publicised at all. As a further confirmation of what we're talking about, I mentioned that the past report excluded sexual violence, sexual coercion from its findings.
Yeah.
But the NISVS report from 2015, it looked at a lifetime prevalence of contact sexual violence, physical violence, and stalking. And it found for men there was a rate of 33.6%, and for women there was a rate of 36.4%. So it was
Pretty close.
pretty close. In other words, comparable rates for both men and women in victimisation. That's the finding of the NISVS report. And I can mention even just another fact which is useful, which shows that women are very capable of committing domestic violence. The NISVS report also looked at kind of domestic violence by groups, and it looked at sexual orientation. And it found that the highest rate of domestic violence by an intimate partner was found among lesbians. The overall lifetime rate for any kind of violence by lesbians was measured at 44%. That for heterosexual men it was 35%, and for men 29%, and for women it was 35%. So again, there's confirmation right up there that women are very
very capable of violence as well.
Of committing violence, not only just physical violence, but also coercive control as well, and psychological violence. It's probably worth saying another word. I think you might have brought it up. The fact that the majority of domestic violence is actually bidirectional.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting fact. And that shows that domestic violence is much more complex than the official narrative would have us believe.
Yeah.
It means that the official narrative has a simplistic view that there's a perpetrator there, usually the male, and there's an innocent victim there, usually the female. But the reports coming out now are showing that the majority of domestic violence is bidirectional.
Yeah.
58% was the figure given by one researcher. And this has major implications for policy, as you can well believe. Not only for policymakers, because it gives a different picture to policymakers, what they need to take into account here. It's also very important for the Gardaí, because if a Garda is called to an incident of domestic violence, that Garda has to be mindful that both parties could be guilty here, not just one.
Yeah.
For instance, for years and years in the US, under the so-called Duluth model of perpetration, the police almost overwhelmingly arrested the man.
Irregardless of what the report was.
Irregardless, yeah. So that's how important a change this is. It's also important for judges, for instance, because if a judge is adjudicating on a case in the courts, the judge has also to bear in mind that it may not be just one partner. It may not even be the partner that is carrying the more scars.
Yeah.
It could be that both partners are seriously involved in it. By the way, another finding of the PASK report, which further strengthens what we've been saying, is that women are just as likely to initiate even physical violence as men are, which might surprise an awful lot of people.
Yeah, I think the obvious question that would come out kind of when you listen to all that, because that's a lot of information, but it really shows that the official narrative is very, very wrong in a lot of ways. So why is that evidence kind of being hidden? Like, is it being kind of covered up by kind of establishment media?
Yeah, it is. It's fair to say that it's being covered up.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, there are several reasons for it. The most obvious reason is there's a lot of money tied up in domestic violence funding by the state, Jeff. An awful lot of money. There's also hundreds of jobs involved. A lot of groups have a stake in maintaining the official narrative because their jobs are involved. And there's a lot of money flowing in which they want to keep coming.
It goes down to that old thing of follow the money, doesn't
follow
it?
the money, it does. And the same was true in the US. I read figures for the state funding of services for women in the US, which were mind-boggling. I think they mentioned something like $1 billion, but it's absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah.
That was the case, even up to about 5 or 6 years ago now. I'm not aware of what has happened since the PASC report has come out. But there's also another reason why it hasn't come into the public domain, and that is the media are complicit here. The media have never conducted a proper examination of domestic violence in this state, for instance. We've had no proper examination of the nature of domestic violence, the causes of it, what it consists of, and the dynamics of it, for as long as I can remember.
And why do you think the media is focused on maintaining that narrative when, like, it's not like their jobs aren't as focused on it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not easy to give a good answer, but I think part of the answer must be that when women's groups were set up, like Women's Aid back in the 1990s, 1980s, Safe Ireland, there was a tremendous amount of sympathy for women who were seen to be the principal victims of domestic violence, and there was a feeling that women, their needs had to be looked after, catered for, and there was a lot of hostility towards men on the other side. So that narrative has been maintained since, and the media are probably wondering, well, if we tell the true picture now, people will start asking, why didn't you do this 10 years ago, 5 years ago? So they're caught in a kind of a web of their own making, is my view of it anyway.
So let's kind of go into kind of like the support that male victims receive here in Ireland. It is pretty pathetic, to say the least. So what groups and services are there in Ireland for men?
Yeah, it's extraordinarily pathetic, Jeff. Extraordinarily pathetic. Briefly, there are just two groups providing services for male victims. One is Men's Aid, which is based in Navan. That's its only base, permanent base in Navan. It has outreach centres in 4 or 5 counties, including Dublin. By the way, there's no permanent office in Dublin where male victims can go. Not in the greater Dublin area. There's no permanent call centre in the main Dublin region with 1.5 million people.
Wow.
And that's the case. The second group that provides services for male victims is Men's Development Network, which is based in Waterford. Now, if you want to compare that with the services for female victims, according to Safe Ireland, which is an umbrella organisation apparently, and which is a national body, by the way, according to Safe Ireland, there are 38 local groups or women's call centres, 38 around the country for women victims. They also, quite a few of them include refugees. A number of them include refugees. Along with the national body Safe Ireland, there's another national body which is Women's Aid, and these two are often called out to be the spokespeople when women's point of view is being looked at by the media. So there are 21 shelters for women at the moment. There's no shelters for men, none. TUSLA has consistently refused to provide a shelter for men on the grounds that there's no need for it. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, there are very serious questions have to be asked around.
I think it kind of goes back to kind of like the statistics we kind of mentioned earlier that definitely shows to be a need for it.
Absolutely.
The official narrative is that there's
absolutely a need for it. But TUSLA have to answer serious questions here. Why they haven't seen a need for male victims in the last 10 years. By the way, Men's Aid were turned down for a call, a 24-hour call line only a year ago.
Yeah, it's currently a 9 to 5
Currently it's 9 to
So,
5, Monday to Friday. Tusla threw them a few breadcrumbs last year. They provided a few hours on a Saturday and Sunday. Can you believe it? This is the first time they actually looked at that fact that the weekend wasn't being covered at all. They threw them a few crumbs then. But it remains that there's no refuge for men. And by the way, as a result of the appalling murder of Ashley Murphy back in January, the feminist groups took advantage of this. They exploited it. Even though that murder had nothing to do with domestic violence.
No.
It was a completely random killing. Safe Ireland and Women's Aid jumped on the bandwagon. And RTE and the media played into their hands by putting the questions to the politicians. And I can remember the question being raised in Morning Island of Micheál Martin, and he being asked very officiously by a presenter, there are 9 counties without a refuge in this country. Taoiseach, what are you going to do about it? And immediately he caved in, of course. Immediately, this is the natural reaction of a politician when he's presented with a question from about women victims, you know. Immediately, he's, we'll build 9. So there's going to be 30 refuges for women, one in every county, and there's still none for men. That's the reality that we're facing. Another fact that's not known about Men's Aid, which is worth highlighting, is that they have, at least in 2021, they had just 2 full-time workers and 4 part-time workers. That's incredible. It's appalling. It's utterly, completely appalling that these people are trying to provide a nationwide service to cover men who are victimised nationwide, and there's 2 full-time and 4 part-time workers, and they got 250,000 euros from Tusla in 2021. Now Tusla dispensed over 30 million in 2021 to all the services,
the different domestic violence services.
And Men's Aid got 250,000. That's less than 1% of the total. Less than 1% of the total.
Despite the fact that all the figures show that.
Even despite the fact that they recorded very dramatic increase in figures during the pandemic. They said they were getting an unprecedented volume of calls during the pandemic, and yet Tusla
had no interest in helping them
and
out.
I think that mirrors exactly. Tusla needs to be brought out into the public domain and have serious questions put to them. Why are you doing this? And they need to be able to answer, because what Tusla are doing is a mirror image of what's happening right across the state agencies. The same attitude is prevailing. We don't bother catering for men. That's the.
And to be honest, though, we constantly hear about kind of horror stories about Tusla not doing their job, and yet nothing changes with
Exactly. Tusla have been indicted dozens of times for not doing their job in relation to child abuse. We can all remember the appalling case of the Maurice McCabe case way back in 2015 or something like that.
Which we mentioned in the first episode.
Exactly, and that was one of the worst cases that ever recorded in that area, and Tusla were completely to blame there. They were to blame for that. So it shows a mindset within Tusla which needs to be brought out into the open.
And I've read cases that are quite similar since that kind of shows that they haven't changed at all.
I agree with you. I don't think they've changed at all. I think that their mindset is that they can do what they like. Now, it should also be remembered that although Tusla is the principal funder of domestic violence services in the state, it's by no means the only one. There are quite a number of other sources of funds provided within the state. For instance, the Department of Justice provides considerable additional funding, and it does. And one of the agencies within the Department of Justice which provides that funding is the Commission for the Victims of Crime, CVC, they provide help for victims of crime. That's a major source, one source of funding.
Yeah.
But the Department of Health provides extra funding. PUBL provides extra funding. The Department of Social Protection provides extra funding. And perhaps one other department. But the point is that across the state there are quite a number of other services providing funding. So the idea that just 30 million is going into the total for state funding for domestic violence, I'd say that's a very low figure.
Yeah.
I'd say it's much higher than that. Much higher.
So let's kind of talk a little bit about kind of legislation. Now, there's a lot of legislation that goes into dealing with domestic violence. But one that Men's Voices Ireland has spoken out quite a bit about is the Istanbul Convention.
Right.
So, briefly, what is the Istanbul Convention and how has it affected how domestic violence is tackled?
Yeah. The Istanbul Convention is a classic example of how even supranational agencies have been taken over, if you like, by feminist ideology. The Istanbul Convention was brought out, ironically enough, by a human rights body, the Council of Europe, which covers, I think, 47 countries across Europe. And they brought out the Council of Europe. I think it was probably published around 2011. But it's completely founded on feminist ideology. And it expounds this feminist theory. It's called the gender paradigm, by the way.
Yeah.
That's the name which people in the US and Canada use for the gender paradigm. Here it might be called the patriarchal theory of domestic violence. But it just simply says that men use violence to control and to subjugate women. That's written into the Istanbul Convention, even in the preamble.
Yeah.
That men use as one of their primary means of controlling and subjugating women is by domestic violence, use of domestic violence. So that's what it encapsulates, and all the provisions of the domestic violence of the Istanbul Convention follow from that basic premise.
Yeah.
But the fact is, they all have been discredited.
Yeah.
The gender paradigm has been completely overturned, refuted. It had been blasted out of the water. It's completely false. That's the finding. The history of the Istanbul Convention is interesting because insofar as I have been able to find out, there was no debate about it.
Yeah, I've actually asked a couple of friends of mine who are quite big into kind of social policies, some of them especially around gender. None of them had heard of it.
No. It was passed into law in this state in 2019. It went through the Oireachtas by stealth.
Yeah.
Like a thief in the night. There was no discussion of it. I don't think anybody even asked a question. I don't think any politician even raised a question or even dared to ask a question about it. They were all so scared, so terrified of saying anything that might offend.
That might challenge it.
Challenge the official ideology. That there was no debate about it within the Oireachtas. Not at all. It sailed through in a day or so. There was no debate about it on media, mainstream media, neither on radio nor on television was there any debate about it. Neither was there any examination of it in the print media. Nobody was asked, no lawyer was asked to write an article about a major international convention and what its consequences down the road were likely to be.
Like, it's a major piece of legislation.
It's a major piece.
Yes. It was never talked about.
Never talked about.
It wasn't debated. Like that, I think that kind of is a great example of the state of our democracy here in Ireland.
It is. It shows we don't have a democracy. In fact, I mean
to be fair,
it means that an international convention, a major international convention, that such a thing could be passed through in total silence and without any murmur from either politicians or media. That shows some kind of state of mind, and it's not favourable to democracy anyway. That's for sure. But as far as I can make out, Jeff, there was no debate about it in any country in which it was ratified. I have been able to find out whether a debate occurred in any European country in which it was ratified. By the way, it's worth noting that the UK hasn't ratified it.
Interesting.
And that is very likely a consequence of Brexit.
Brexit.
Yeah, it's tied up with Brexit. We're not going to be lectured here by an EU Commission who wants us to ratify this document, because the EU are in favour of this as well as the Council of Europe. But the British decided, no, we're not going to take.
Do you think that was partly one of the reasons why there wasn't so much discussion about it, because it was the EU that was really pushing its member states to kind of adopt it?
Yeah.
And we're kind of like, we all know about Micheál Martin and Leo being very happy yes men to the
that's right.
European
Union. To the EU Commission, yeah, they're very, very, very happy to say yes. Yeah, it could have been. To be honest with you, I don't know whether there was actually discussion about it in the UK or not. I'm not sure. But it's worth noting that there are still at least 7 countries which haven't ratified it out of the out of the total. At least 7 countries, and several of them are EU countries. For instance, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Lithuania and Latvia. They haven't ratified it.
Any idea as to why?
They're more sensible. they have more common sense than to ratify a nonsensical treaty.
Yeah.
Because not one politician would dare come out in public and defend that treaty on a public platform.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do it.
Because they'd be
destroyed.
They'd be annihilated.
They'd be destroyed. Yeah. Yeah.
So to kind of finish up here about kind of what we want to see change, but I think the funding needs to be, the funding for male victims needs to be increased dramatically.
Yeah, it needs to be increased hugely. It needs to be set on a realistic footing.
Yeah.
In fact, what we would be looking for is funding on a par with those for women.
Yeah.
It should be on a par, given that the international evidence is so strong.
It's so strong to suggest that it's
equal, that it's on a par across all different types. And then, of course, there should be shelters for male victims as well. There should be shelters on a par with those for women set up, because we don't even know the extent of how many men have been driven to distraction by virtue of the fact that there's no shelter for them to go to.
Yeah.
We don't know how many men have been made homeless, for instance, as a result of this, and been forced out of the street as a result of this. The media, although I'm not sure whether I should say at this point in time that I have no faith whatsoever in the media. Nevertheless, the media needs to start focusing on realistically on these issues and start educating the public as to what's going on here. Start setting up a public forum for debates between those who favour the Istanbul Convention and those who are against it.
Yeah.
And having a proper debate about domestic violence, because it's never been held at all in this country. That's what needs, because we need to educate the media, and we need to educate the politicians and the policy makers and those in the state agencies who are responsible for dispensing funds and services.
Yeah, I think also, I think it's fair to say that Men's Aid does great work with the very little funding that they have.
Extraordinary.
Imagine if they actually got proper funding. They do. They have done great work in the last couple of years, since they appointed a new CEO there last year, Katrina Bentley, who, to be fair, has done a lot of work to get to draw public attention to this fact, and she's managed to get a number of articles in newspapers to highlight the extent of male victimization. So they would certainly, and they need to have, for a very start, they need to have centres in the major cities. Yeah.
A couple in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Waterford.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So they need to have realistic support services in the major towns, the major cities, anyway, for a start.
Yeah.
That's just a start.
Yeah.
And there needs to be, as I said, there needs to be proper debate about the nature and the dynamics of the domestic violence.
Yeah, like you mentioned about educating the media, educating politicians. I think we also kind of need to educate society a bit, and I think awareness is such a big part of that. Yeah, but yeah, awareness of kind of male victims of domestic violence, we very rarely see it publicly. So what would be the best way to improve awareness?
I guess that it has to come through the main sources by which people get their information, through the mainstream media. That has to be a major part of it. They have to engage with the public. They have to stage proper debates around this issue. Bring in experts from both sides. Bring in those who support the official narrative, and bring in experts who disagree with the official narrative and who would challenge the official narrative, and let the public see the facts. Let both sides present the evidence that's there on their side for their side of the story, and let the public decide where the bulk or the balance lies. That's what's needed.
So that's pretty much it for this episode. So if you want to find out more about Men's Voices Ireland, you can visit our website www.mensvoicesireland.com. You can contact us by email, mensvoicesireland@gmail.com. Now, Men's Voices Ireland, we rely on donations from the public to kind of do the work that we do. So if you would like to donate, go to the donate section on our website. So it's mensvoicesireland.com/donate. And you can also follow us on our various social media accounts. So it's @Men's Voices on Facebook, it's Men's Voices Ireland on Instagram, and it's @mensvoices_IRL on Twitter. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. Now, as this has been an episode on domestic violence, if you're a male victim of domestic violence, you can contact Men's Aid on 01 554 3811, or you can email them at hello@mensaid.ie. Now, if you like this episode, like and share it so people get more information about what's going on. And if you want to join the conversation, leave a comment below. We'd actually love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.